New Gloucester, Maine is just a little north of Portland, and Bates College is the place to study or to learn or to teach. And Lynne Lewis is a professor at Bates College, and she's been studying rivers and dams and property values and things like that. Thanks for taking the time, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Now, one of your colleagues who is in a different discipline, urban planning, Richard Florida, interesting name, whose path I crossed at the University of Toronto's urban planning department, has made a big deal out of how people, especially young people, like to live near water. To which I've said, well, we already are living near water because the waterways were our transport system for hundreds of years before other things were invented. So he may have just been like the fish discovering water. But you've discovered something else, that some people don't like to live near certain bodies of water. Can you explain?
Sure. The rivers in much of the Northeast were industrial sites, and they were frequently polluted waterways with lots of big industry, paper mills, textile mills. And so the history is one of pretty filthy waterways. And if you drive along the rivers, you'll notice many of the older homes, older businesses are turned away. They face away from the river, away from the smell. One of the authors of the Clean Water Act, the U.S. Clean Water Act, grew up along the Androscoggin River, which is just north of Lewiston, Maine, which is where Bates College is. And it was because of the mills and the pollution in the river. And so since the Clean Water Act was signed, the rivers have become much cleaner, but they were still riddled with dams that blocked fish passage, that blocked clean water flows. And slowly over time, some of those dams have been removed, restoring those flows, restoring the fisheries. People are coming back to the river. It's improving property values, but people have been willing to pay historically to be further away from the river.
Well, this is counterintuitive because people in my part of the world, let's say Toronto, Montreal, they make a big deal out of going to the Canadian Maritimes or New England in the summers, either with property they own or rent. And I worked with a wonderful scientist in Chicago who just could not wait to retire and get to his place in Maine. So you've really opened our eyes to another version of that magnetism that water has for us. But being an academic, you also tried to quantify what people would pay to not live near this smelly water. Tell me about that study.
That's right. Well, we've done studies on several rivers looking at home sales and georeferencing home sales with their proximity to different things, whether those things are positive or negative, distance from the waterway, distance from dam sites, remove dam sites, and try to quantitatively estimate the impact on property values. And we have found consistently in these more urban for Maine areas, there has been a negative impact on property values close to dam sites. And we've also noticed that over time, as dams have been removed, those negative impacts have disappeared.
Now, as you can tell from looking at me, I'm kind of a cranky old man, and sometimes think, oh, well, these research studies, asking people would they pay or might they move, they're so hypothetical, you kind of say almost anything to get the pollster or the academic out of your life. But you've looked at the actual sales. This is really something that people do, and the home values that you've looked at are true in reality, not just in a hypothetical discussion with someone. Is that right?
That's right. These are based on actual home sales. This is not survey work, although we've done some survey work to try to tease out what home buyers are thinking. But these studies that you're talking about are just based on home sales, and you can break apart the price of a product, the price of anything, into the value of each of its attributes. Whether it's color or shape or quality. And that same is true for housing. How many bedrooms does it have? Does it have a pool? How big is the yard? How close is it to a landfill or a dam or a beautiful vista? And you can estimate what the impacts are on the price of those various pieces.
And I assume including the psychological value of having an amenity or being away from something you consider a disamenity, whether you use them or not. There's sort of just a value in your mind. Is that right?
Well, we don't know much about the psychological value. We just know what people have paid for the house and what the various characteristics are. So I'm hesitant to think about the psychology in there.
Well, then let's go back to reality and dams then. And I was kind of surprised reading your academic research that, what is it, 1,200 dams have been removed in America in recent history?
That's right. That's
I
right.
mean, I'm way behind the times. I thought they were a symbol of progress and power generation and maybe even tourism and creating the old swimming hole. But a lot of them have really outlived their usefulness, right?
That's right. Some of them have been removed simply for safety reasons. They've outlived their useful life. They're not safe. They've been removed. Nobody wants them anymore. Perhaps they are some of them are hydropower dams. Some of those weren't producing much power to begin with. And when the mill's gone, that power is not of much value. There was a small dam removed in Winslow, Maine. It was only a 1.5 megawatt dam. It produced enough power to sort of cover the line losses. You know, electricity dissipates as it travels various distances. So it was a tiny, tiny project, yet it was blocking the entire river. So when you think about, as an economist, we think about trade-offs. So what are the other kinds of values that can be restored if we remove? We're losing some hydropower, so that's a cost, but we're getting something back, and that's recreational fisheries and ecosystem services and other sorts of water quality benefits to that community.
Well, gee, we lasted a few minutes before you got into the technical terms
Ah,
from academic life. When you talk about the other values, is this use values, like as opposed to the dam and the hydroelectric power, there are fish or recreation or other uses? Is that what you mean?
some of them are use values. Use values I just like to describe as something you've used your senses to experience. And so if you are fishing or walking along the river, absolutely that's a use value. There may be other types of values that we don't experience, but we're grateful that they're there. But yes, these are mostly use values.
And this is a worldwide phenomenon. You cite the fact that there have been something like 38 studies of dam removals and 24 in America. And I bet, being an academic near Lewiston, Maine, you've had time to read most of these. What have you found out?
This is not, this is a trend. I think things are changing. Well, let me back up. Large dams are still being built in many countries, but the small dams are starting to be removed for the purposes of river restoration. When many of these dams were built, the considerations for how to make a decision on what we're gaining and what we're losing were really based solely on hydropower concerns and not on any kind of environmental concerns. And now that's changing. So we're seeing decision making that is more holistic, if you will, just trying to incorporate all of the pros and cons of a project when we decide what to do with it. And so there are dams being removed all over the world.
Yeah, I was going to say, no one's talking about removing the Hoover Dam or the Grand Coulee Dam or even the Three Gorges Dam and these big projects in India and China, but the small ones are just kind of passe, I guess, aren't they?
Some of them are, yeah. Some of them aren't. Some of them are still money makers. There's been some innovations on fish passage, so fish elevators are kind of fun and interesting to watch, especially this time of year. The alewives are streaming back up the rivers, and there'll be elevators full of fish to get them past those dams. And so there's other ways to move anadromous fish, but yeah, a lot of dams are coming
Now,
out.
I'm calling from Canada, of course, and we Canadians, many of us are called moss backs. Do you know why that is?
No, I don't.
Oh, well, because we so admire America, we are looking south to America, and the moss grows on the north side of our backs because we're habitually looking at and admiring America. But here's something we don't really get: why
Even
everything.
now?
Pardon me?
Even now?
All the time, all through history, I can tell you.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, during the War of 1812, there was a bit of a truce between, I think, New Brunswick and Maine. So many of the regional connections survived even that. But here's what I don't get. Why would dam removal be split along party lines? Your President Clinton was somewhat in favor of dam removal and river restoration, and President Bush was not. Why is this a political issue?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't understand why some of these things become political footballs. It may be the hydropower interests are lobbyists for one party and not the other. I think that uh, the Democratic Party tends to have more generous policy toward environmental restoration.
Well, explaining American politics is going to be too big a task for me today, but thank you for participating and trying. So let's go back. One of the other economic things that you looked at was the value of what might be called sport fishing, or private anglers or individual people who fish, as opposed to the commercial fishery. And wasn't it some of your research that indicated that that was actually more valuable in many communities than the commercial fishery?
Well, it depends what commercial fishery you're talking about, but absolutely, these sport fishing industries, the sport fishing values up these rivers. So we're not talking about the ocean fish, we're not talking about the lobster industry, but we're talking about shad and sturgeon and Atlantic salmon that are very fun to catch. Uh, People will pay a lot of money for a guided fishing trip. They spend a lot of money on fishing gear. And so, yes, these bring enormous values into communities.
Well, interesting. My, shall we say, stomping grounds in the vernacular involves the border between Maine and New Brunswick, St. Stephen, St. Andrews, Fredericton, where I went to university and where I've returned multiple times a year, and family still has a home there and so on in the region. So what would be your advice for the people of St. Andrews, St. Stephen, and that area who are looking at the restoration of the St. Croix or Scoodic River?
Well, I would advise looking for win-wins. And I think the Penobscot River restoration, which isn't too far away, the Penobscot River in Maine, is a great example. So that was an effort, an agreement that was signed by the energy company that owned the dams, the federal government, the state government, the Penobscot Indian Nation, and a coalition of environmental groups that got together and said, how can we have what everybody wants? And what that project entailed was removing the lowest two dams on the system, building fish passage on a third, and building an innovative bypass around the fourth dam, which had some historic value and the town didn't want to lose that dam, freeing up 1,000 migratory miles for endangered Atlantic salmon and 500 miles for species that don't travel as far, like the shad and the sturgeon. But at the same time, they enhanced the turbines on the tributary dams and maintained just about 100% of the hydropower. So it's really an amazing project that allowed all of the stakeholders to come to the table and negotiate what they wanted. Now, part of this came about because the dams were coming up for relicensing, and it was the energy company that said, oh, we're going to be asked to build expensive fish passage, so maybe we can figure out a way to work around some of these things so that everybody's happy. And they did. And maybe that's a rare case, but I think it sets a unique model for bringing stakeholders together to talk about what they want and how can we make this work instead of just butting heads.
Well, it's funny, you bring together so many interesting things: the end of life of dams, the easier ways to generate power with solar, for example, the value of the fish. And I've read some work that I'm sure you've read that very often you can lose a minuscule amount of the hydro generating power, but gain an enormous amount in so-called biomass, living fish, and even whales and porpoises and so on and so forth. I guess you're familiar with that work too.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Wonderful to be able to speak with you. I hope that one day I can make one of my regular trips to the Maine coast, go to the outlet malls, come a little north, and see you in person. But I really appreciate
I would enjoy that. Thank you. Thank you.
you.